Okay, so hi everybody. Today is Tuesday, July 9th. I am Aaron of SIGBeard. You are at the Kubernetes SIG Testing weekly meeting. I will paste the agenda in the doc again, or the agenda in Zoom chat again, if anybody wants to sort of like mark their attendance or whatever. And so I wanted to kick us off with a discussion. I wanted us to talk this week a little bit about planning around Prow. The first thing I wanted us to talk about was like what it would take to split Prow into its own sub-project. And I feel like, so I'm pasting in a link for the issue there in chat. I feel like the first step would be to break the config up out of the Prow code base. And maybe Steve, since you're on the line, and Daniel, like maybe you two can share sort of what your experience has been if you have the config embedded with the code base in a fork, or if you're running with the config separate, and what sorts of things we might want to watch out for.
No, we've got the config separate. I don't think there's any gotchas anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, Eric added options to put the files wherever you want them to have them.
Yeah, for us, I think we have it in the same repo. We have a config updater that just updates the config as it's running as well. Nothing special. I think there's no problem with having the config anywhere.
Okay. So Steve, I see you had two PRs out there that you had opened a while back to sort of kick us off down that path. You know what? I guess just so we're all looking at the same thing while I'm talking, I will share my screen if that's cool with everybody. So there was something about updating the config updater. Oh man, Zoom's stupid little bar is in the way. This is annoying.
I think the thought with this one was the idea was we could seamlessly cut over. In reality, that doesn't work. So, if there's like other PRs in flight to change the config at the same moment that we change the definition of where that config comes from, they'll just have to be updated.
So any PRs that are in flight that modify config.yaml and plugin.yaml are either going to hit like a rebase conflict if we were to migrate things, or we would have to merge all of those before we did a movement. Is that right?
Yeah.
If we're really worried about that being a problem, we can put a blockade on those files, like one of the other repos did recently.
Yeah, but at the same time too, like this could be done in 30 seconds and not hit any problems.
Shouldn't Git handle that anyway, so long as we just move it first?
Well, yeah, there's just the potential for like having to rebase if other PRs go in while you're trying to do it.
Yeah, I think Git will mostly handle those moves. So reconfiguring the config updater, that's about config.yaml and plugins.yaml. There are other things in this checklist. When you talk about remaining config files, what are those? It's just config.yaml and plugins.yaml. Okay.
Oh yeah, so the process described here was like start listening on the new place for updates, move the files, and then stop listening on the old place. And so like that's the process that doesn't work, right? So we'd have to do that cutover pretty quickly.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the rest of it, so I think there's a lot of docs and whatnot that point to those files, so we're just gonna have to run through and make sure we update all those.
So I'm super interested in getting the first three done pretty quickly. Or soonish. I'm interested in helping out with these. How do we feel about moving Prow cluster to config cluster? I feel like that my guess is that might be a little more tangled up with things like tackle, assuming where the cluster files are and stuff as well. But or like canonical examples of what good cluster files would be. But I feel like this would be the next logical step. Do we think this is feasible to do in this quarter?
It should just be a matter of chasing the references through all the different like Bazel stuff and the updaters and whatnot. Like, I don't think technically it's challenging.
Yeah, I think this is pretty easy to do. It makes sense.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and milestone this into the V116 milestone, and I will assign myself. Does anybody else want to help out with this?
I'm already on there, right?
Yes, you are assigned to it. And I'm sort of assuming by default I'm going to be running this through whoever is on call for the Prow instance.
I can also help with that.
All right. So this gets us as far as splitting up the config and stuff. I personally would be really interested in having a discussion about breaking it up into its own repo as well. But I don't know if we feel like we have enough time to go through that today. My concern is there are more things than just the code that lives inside of the Prow directory that are involved in our deployment of Prow. So I think about like the fact that GH proxy lives outside of the Prow directory, but is actively used in most deployments at scale. And then the fact that there are many things inside of the Prow directory, or there are some things in the Prow directory, like its GitHub client, that are used elsewhere. I don't know if that is as much of a problem. Just Go imports will just handle that.
Wouldn't that be part of how the config is set up? Because the starter YAML could be in a way as empty as not having the GH proxy in it and basically deploying it after. So moving that part out while having the part that deploys GH proxy to Prow could live in the GH proxy part.
That's very true. I mean, like GH proxy is not included in the starter deployment. As far as I know, like I used Tackle to set up an instance of Prow, and I didn't get GH proxy for free with all of that. So if I want to add GH proxy, I'm going to have to sort of manually create the cluster files that add that to my thing, and that's fine. I just feel like Red Hat and Google have experienced that Prow is not very useful to us without GH proxy. And it is unclear to me how tightly coupled GH proxy is to Prow itself.
I mean, I think we're making design decisions now, assuming that it's in place.
Yeah, we should probably start bundling it with Prow. That being said, like it's totally usable for other things besides Prow. It's not coupled to Prow, but Prow is starting to potentially be coupled to it.
And I think the larger question could also just be like, if we're moving this into a separate repo, you know, part of it's to like make the actual development process easier, to like co-locate things that are related. So I don't know. I think the semantic argument of like whether or not it's technically part of Prow, I'm okay with it moving into the repo, even if it's not.
I think maybe just to make the best use of the time we have, let me just sort of take a step back, because I think walking through everything that it would be involved in migrating Prow to its own subproject might kick up a bunch of tech debt. Is this something that we want to commit to this quarter? Or do we feel like committing to splitting up the code base from the config is sort of enough of a start? Because that way, like people could, if we wanted to point people at how to get started, like they can just kind of get started with a config and they don't have to fork our repo or whatever.
Yeah, I think splitting up the config and code is definitely the bigger part. So I'd be happy to, or like I think that might be a better thing to start with.
And I mean, the second part will do wonders for my personal GitHub notifications. So I'll at least commit to doing the investigation of like what it would take.
I think we should look, I think we haven't sufficiently explored the idea of moving the config into its own repo. Like, I feel like there's kind of tier 1, tier 2, and maybe tier 3, right? Like the config definitely should be not part of the Prow development notifications. Something like GH proxy, on the other hand, probably maybe should. Obviously, something like Plank definitely should be part of the Prow notifications. Something like kubetest, probably should live somewhere else. But it might actually be easier to move things like kubetest and the config out into its own repo and sort of just leave all of the other stuff, in the same repo. Like maybe not, maybe so. But I feel like we've primarily only looked at the idea of moving Prow out. And it might make the sense to like move everything else aside from Prow out and keep Prow where it is today.
That is also possible. So I think maybe what I would suggest we commit to is at least moving the config into its own directory, and then maybe consider moving the config into its own repo as sort of a bonus. Because when I start thinking about probably the config changes that you don't care about if you're just working on Prow, the code base, is you probably also don't care about test grid config changes. And I feel like there's probably you would probably want to talk about moving test grid config changes into a separate repo. And then we want to start talking about how we're linting all of that, making sure that that agrees with where Prow is at and stuff. So I feel like moving the config into its own repo might be also more of a scope creep, but maybe a more reasonable scope creep than moving Prow into its own repo.
I think it might be, I think that moving all of the config outside of the place where the binary is a useful thing to try and commit to this quarter. Like, I think it's not good that as we are doing an increasing amount of test grid development in the test grid folder, I think it will make increasingly less sense to have the test grid configuration live alongside that. For the same reasons it doesn't make sense to have the Prow code base live alongside the Prow Kubernetes config. And so, like I know Michelle and Sean were actually sort of talking about the fact that that's confusing, and we're thinking about doing that today. So I think there will be general interest in moving all the config into its own location. Whether that is, and I think its own directory is a good first start. The best way to separate them into different repos to get better GitHub notifications, I think we can design as we go.
Okay. I think I've captured some of that here. I won't watch you all type me up. Make you all watch me type up GitHub issues for this if there aren't GitHub issues that exist already for this. So second thing I wanted to talk about was Prow epics is maybe some good fodder for ideas of what we want to commit to this quarter. So how do I pronounce your name? Is it Alvaro?
Alvaro, stress the first syllable.
Alvaro, okay. So I went ahead and created a tracking issue for this. I am under the impression this is something we are actively pushing to iterate on this quarter. It's unclear to me what is feasible to land, and it feels like we are currently in the process of hashing that out. So I just made a tracking issue and dropped it in our milestone with links to the KEP that you have written, as well as sort of the sketch PR that you wrote as well. Do we sort of agree this is a thing we're gonna try and chew through this quarter?
So the last state of the discussion there was that we weren't completely in agreement with regards how much complexity this will introduce, and if people are fine with that. That is the reason the sketch PR was created, because my opinion is that it's doable with a feasible amount of complexity. Cole didn't completely agree on that, and that was sort of a demonstration. And yeah, the next step is to like have someone go over the thing and have an opinion.
Yeah, based on the conversation with Steve and Alvaro, it sounds like it's something that we can probably introduce. We wanted to take a look at the sketch. I'm going to look at this today, so we'll know a little bit more about that soon. But yeah, I think it's something that we'd like to have at least as an option. I'm not sure if it'll be usable for all of everyone's use cases, but I think we're trying to at least check it out. Not sure if we want to commit to a timeline though or not.
Okay. Well, so what I was thinking is like we can drop this into the current milestone to show that like we're kind of, this is something we're looking at this quarter. It doesn't necessarily mean we're guaranteed to close out literally everything in our milestone. Historically, we don't tend to do that. But at least like if I have to tell people like generally speaking what we're working on this quarter, I can just point them at this milestone. Okay. The next thing I didn't get as far as making a tracking issue for this, but enabling open management of prowcates.io. So I think splitting up the config from the binaries will sort of help with that. I initially had approached this thinking that as a prerequisite, Prow needed to live over in CNCF owned infrastructure, which I'm trying to push over in that area. But I think regardless, but today, Steve does have some level of access to our Prow cluster. Like, we can't give non-Googlers access to all GCP resources, but we can give them access to our Kubernetes cluster. Does that reflect the state of where we're at today?
Yeah, I have enough effective access to be on call and to do anything that would be.
So the feedback I got was what we are missing is actually managing the on-call rotation in a way that you could be put into the rotation. We're using like some tool inside of Google that happens to be super awesome and be aware of our calendars and auto-rotate things accordingly. And kind of what we need is something that runs more out in the open where we could maintain a list of who's on call when.
I mean, I think that's half of it. I think and to some extent we can fudge that with, existing calendar tools. I think the beefier half of it is actually defining what it means to be on call, like what the process is when things go wrong. Like, yeah, everything to do with the what.
Yeah, so maybe Eric and Cole, how do you feel about this?
So I think that, I think it would be good to sort of, clarify. I think internally we've done a little bit of iterating on what the, requirements are and sort of documenting how we respond to things and whatnot. I would say that we should definitely figure out the way that we can, create a on-call schedule. We don't really so I think both those things make sense.
Yeah, I think the way I'm sort of phrasing this to myself is I want to enable more community members than Steve to go on call for Prow. Because I trust that Steve has been deep inside of the Prow code base for a long time and generally has a vague sense of how to read the tea leaves of Prow operationally, given that he runs his own Prow instance. But there are no real documents that describe how to do that and what the expectations are and all of that. And so I think we can, before we open up to more people than Steve, I think we need to have some of those on-ramps and documents in place. But I also want to make sure that we're addressing whatever technical limitations there are to give us the opportunity to sort of iterate on those docs.
Yeah, I think that's kind of why I broke this up into those two subheadings we've got.
I think the biggest technical blocker is just, like Eric mentioned, we need a schedule. Once we've got that, we've already got like an outline for docs, I think, or at least we have like kind of started to codify what we think we want to have. So I think the biggest blocker is just having some way to schedule people.
Okay. Those were the two things I definitely wanted to talk about in this doc. Those were the first two items in this doc. To make the most use of our time here, did anybody have anything else in this doc they specifically wanted to speak to today?
The one after the one you've got on screen, I would.
Yeah.
Or maybe this one and the last one. So I think one of the things that Prow is currently missing like pretty hard is seamless self-service for the config. And I think we can, this needs to be there's a lot of pieces to seamless self-service. Like we've already committed to some of them. I think, really good work is being done for triggering stuff from the web, for instance. But there's a lot of tiny pieces to this, and I think we should probably at some point choose which ones to commit to. They're not all necessarily intertangled, and so it's kind of a la carte. But that being said, a couple of these do sort of rely on, like if you want to provide people changing the configuration files with feedback on whether their changes are going to work in production, there's not really a way to do that with high fidelity without actually running, the jobs. So if the security stance of prow.case.io is that people checking in job config can't be trusted to check in job config for security reasons, some of these are kind of a no-go. So it would be good to level set on like what we feel is achievable here.
I agree. Having tried to go through and sort of update the docs for writing jobs, I found these two things that I highlighted, like actually running the job to make sure that it worked, to be not the most intuitive experience. Purely because there was a delta between, I know how to use this tool that Eric wrote called Phano, which like given a Prow job can synthesize a Docker command to run a container, but that doesn't accurately simulate the behavior once you run it on a Prow instance that is configured to inject pod utils. And so the parts of pod utils that like munged the go path kind of messed with me, and I didn't have a way to easily verify that.
Even past that, if we were to get over that technical hurdle, there's always going to be the difference between your local environment and whatever volumes and config maps and whatnot exist in the actual build cluster.
So I don't have great thoughts on how to commit to fixing any of these things, but I do think I'm going to be kicking in a couple of things that enable better self-service to config changes. And my thought or hope would be that we could use like linting or something against config changes to sort of use pre-submits to enforce that people can or cannot do certain config changes. But by sharding things up more, we would empower people to iterate with their jobs. Like, so for like credentials or secret stuff, right? For example, we could maybe say that like secrets can only, or label presets that define secrets can only be injected in a directory over which we have more control, or something like that.
We have some precedents for these kind of checks in the check config utility. I don't think we have stuff that's really specific to jobs yet, but we can certainly be adding that kind of stuff there.
Yes, and that's the sort of thing where it's not clear to me. I think once you get into how tightly you want to mandate conventions around jobs is maybe more of a bespoke project-specific thing. Like I think maybe the way that OpenShift trusts, like OpenShift I believe trusts their developers to use some kind of staging cluster or something, whereas as a large open source project, we can't necessarily extend that same level of trust to the audience that we serve.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, yeah, we need to do some serious thinking about that specific statement, because there's about 1 million ways to poke a hole into the current security posture. And it's unclear to me if like linted pre-submit stuff doesn't like just reduce to the same thing, right? Because right now, if I made a PR to KK and got an OK to test label, I could change the scripts that are being run. And I know the entry points that the jobs are using, so it's kind of a moot point.
that's all really worth considering in the context of like potentially a bug bounty program being opened up for the Kubernetes project, for what it's worth.
Yeah. So I think for this, like this entire like self-service section, at least like the stuff for giving developers feedback on the changes they're making to config, I think the first step is we need to talk to like within ourselves, and then I would guess with the steering committee, maybe like figure out like what is an acceptable level of access we're going to give to people changing job config, and what's fine from that posture standpoint. And then once we have that decision, like then we can decide which of these we can finish during a quarter, because we'll know which of them are actually attainable goals.
I agree with most of that, except I don't think this is a thing that the steering committee needs to be involved in per se. I'm going to look more towards like the project security team, who cares about the security of the product, and whomever owns the bug bounty program when that's put together. But I know that they're talking about, you know, rewarding people not just for like bugs in the code base, but also making sure people can't break into very critical assets to the project, like our GitHub account, our YouTube account, our CI system, all the places we store our assets, things like that. So let's maybe consider having more of a discussion around some self-service items. I'm going to kick in a couple things into the milestone that maybe work around this, and we can maybe noodle around what we're willing to commit to and talk about this next week. Does that sound fair to people? My thought on best practices for CRDs and API machinery is maybe to wait a little bit. I feel like our SIG architecture is currently discussing what even those best practices are, and what level of review is required for things like CRDs, which may impact what direction we want to head.
Potentially. I think we are so far behind the curve. Even targeting the bare minimum would help us a lot. All of us doing some of that work. I think that just depends on how excited we are to do it.
I would agree. I think it's at a point where we need it, but it's not. I don't think it's at a critical point yet. We can probably wait a little bit longer. And like Eric's saying, there's a lot of stuff that's going to be probably a lot smoother in 6 months or so.
Okay.
I would also say that maybe we could, you know, focus it around. So, for example, I'm, you know, like right now, Tide is fairly slow at recognizing when a PR has the right status context, or I mean, that's a bad example, but there are various things that are kind of slow because we use polling right now, and you know, yeah. So I mean, we could just focus it on making Prow better and faster, and the most efficient way to do that is to adopt good practices for CRDs. Or is this something else?
That's a subset of it.
Yeah. Okay.
And I mean, we could, yeah. So like right now, the worst case scenario is like, we could improve the responsiveness of Plank, for instance, to new jobs being scheduled by a factor of 100.
Okay, I'm getting kicked out of my room. That's our 30 minutes. Thanks everybody for this discussion. I will see you all on Slack. Happy Tuesday.
All right. Bye.
Have a good one. Bye.